Here's what The Sopranos never admits out loud. The psychic wasn't bluffing, and the show quietly proves the supernatural is real. For a series ostensibly devoted to the grimy realism of North Jersey mob life, The Sopranos displays an almost mischievous affection for the supernatural. Nothing ostentatious, no levitating capos or spectral shootouts, but just enough ghostly interference to unsettle the characters and provoke endless arguments about whether the visions are spiritual encounters or simply the byproducts of stress, morphine, or Catholic guilt. And nowhere is this ambiguity more tantalizing than in the infamous Season 2 psychic scene, where a medium casually dredges up the name and grievances of one of Paulie Walnut's long-buried victims. The reaction, both within the story and among the audience, tends to alternate between two camps. The first insists the psychic is legitimate, an emissary of spirits with every right to ruin Paulie's afternoon. The second prefers a more earthly explanation, offering cold reading, educated guesses, and Paulie's well-documented inability to shut his mouth as the likely culprit. The show, of course, delights in refusing to tell anyone which interpretation is correct. The psychic's performance hardly helps the skeptics. He rattles off an Italian nickname common enough to be safe bait, yet lands on a name that just so happens to belong to Paulie's first kill. He asks about poison ivy, a condition Paulie recently endured, though the scene's logic would require the psychic either to be remarkably lucky or in possession of surveillance powers the FBI would envy. He makes references vague enough to be dismissed as probing, and pointed enough to terrify Paulie. Meanwhile, Paulie, never a model of composure under spiritual pressure, supplies the rest by panicking himself into confession by reaction. Cold-reading theorists cling tightly to this explanation. The idea is simple. Toss out a few high-probability statements about a man who looks unmistakably like a mob enforcer, let the body language do the heavy lifting, and allow Paulie's guilt to complete the sentence. Under this model, the psychic gets credit for luck rather than clairvoyance. It is the mundane, sensible interpretation. It also feels like the sort of interpretation nobody on the show, least of all Paulie, wants to believe. The competing theory, in many circles the favored one, is that The Sopranos simply includes supernatural fact. Subtle, infrequent, but undeniably present. After all, the evidence extends well beyond one jittery session with a medium. Big Pussy appears in a mirror at Livia's wake. A mysterious old man loiters near the family, unacknowledged by anyone except the camera. Ghostly presences make their way into scenes after Livia's death. Chris Montesanti's brush with the afterlife includes an entire tour of hell, complete with familiar faces and ominous timestamps. Paulie later receives a visit from the Virgin Mary herself, strolling into the back office of the Bada Bing as though it were the most natural venue for a divine encounter. Even the cat lingering near Christopher's shrine seems aware of truths no animal should possess, staring down his photograph with unnerving insistence. The supernatural also intrudes on Tony Soprano's inner world. His coma sequences in Season 6 resist reduction to mere dream logic. They operate with an uncanny coherence that traditional analysis cannot quite corral. Whether one labels them visions, liminal experiences, or a prolonged metaphysical prank, they exist outside the bounds of ordinary unconsciousness. David Chase himself has publicly discouraged interpreting them as simple dreams, which is about as close to a declaration of supernatural canon as the show ever offers. The ambiguity often dissolves, ironically, when fans attempt to reinterpret these moments through purely psychological frameworks. Tony seeing Pussy's ghost is attributed to guilt. The cat's fixation becomes a symbol of Paulie's unresolved resentment toward Christopher, whom he treated with paternal affection and occasional sadism. Livia's apparitions appear as AJ's method of processing her death. Such readings are tidy, respectable, and completely insufficient. It is difficult to maintain that the show intends them as hallucinations when the camera itself is granted privileged access to these entities whose presence persists, regardless of who perceives them.
Some viewers, perhaps uncomfortable with spiritual implications, concoct elaborate alternate theories.
The psychic, they argue, was an FBI plant. Paulie's girlfriend fed him details. Deleted scenes allegedly reveal entire conspiracies involving agents being devoured by shape-shifting capos, proof that satire thrives where ambiguity reigns. This brand of explanation, rooted more in comic invention than textual evidence, inadvertently reinforces the core issue. The scene works because it refuses to behave like the rest of the show's grounded criminal world. Other responses take a more theatrical approach, declaring the psychic's accuracy the result of satanic black magic, sick business, as though Paulie's misfortunes were orchestrated by demons with a flair for symbolism and a particular interest in botanical rashes. The show itself seems to enjoy this interpretation, presenting Paulie's fear of the paranormal as both comic and tragic. He operates under the belief that his charitable donations ought to offer some spiritual immunity, as though heaven and hell are governed by the same unwritten rules that regulate mob sit-downs. Unfortunately for him, the supernatural, if it exists, appears to have even less respect for rules than the New York families. More earnest reflections come from those who describe near-death or coma experiences eerily similar to Tony's, insisting that the realism of those dreamlike states strengthens the supernatural reading rather than negates it. Others prefer to emphasize the pattern. Every time characters encounter the metaphysical, it is tied to guilt, sin, or debts unpaid. In this moral landscape, divine or infernal forces occasionally slip through the cracks to remind these men that consequences exist beyond indictments and territory disputes. Ultimately, the psychic's knowledge is neither definitively explained nor dismissed. The writers seem far more interested in the tension created when a hardened gangster is forced to consider that the universe may contain forces that do not recognize omerta. Whether the medium is a fraud, a conduit, or a terrified man with excellent instincts hardly matters. What matters is that Paulie believes, and in the world of the Sopranos, belief, especially when it is the only thing the characters cannot control, becomes its own form of truth. The unresolved nature of the scene is not a flaw, but a statement. Supernatural elements in The Sopranos function like the show's morality, pervasive, contradictory, impossible to escape, and positioned deliberately at the edges of perception. The afterlife never bursts through the door demanding attention. Instead, it slips in quietly, stares through a mirror, whispers through a medium, or meows by a photograph. The ambiguity is the point. In a universe built on denial, self-deception, and half-truths, the supernatural appears exactly as it should, undeniable, unconfirmable, and permanently inconvenient. So how did the psychic know? Perhaps through genuine communion with the dead? Perhaps through a knack for reading guilt like an open ledger? Or perhaps, fittingly for a world defined by equal parts brutality and superstition, it is simply one more reminder that the past never stays buried, no matter how deeply it's been shoved into the Pine Barrens.